Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. This is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy to being alive. And I also make sure that we talk about sustainability as well. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and today I'd like to welcome Jenna Mikus to the show. Jenna is coming all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Jenna, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited we can finally make this happen. We've spoken a couple of times and we finally made the stars align tonight. Let's start by having you tell us about your background, education, kind of work you've done, and the things you're working on today, just so people get to know you.
Sure thing. Wow, that's a lot to cover, but I'll do my best. So it's a rather circuitous path, but that said, I do think it's the best way to describe what I'm doing today and how I got here. So I started out by being a very artsy engineer as a child. I did competitive piano, singing, and dance, in addition to lots and lots of science-based and math-based work. So I was introduced to the idea of engineering when I was pretty young and just kept exploring that as I was seeking out colleges, and ended up doing mechanical engineering with business and some art history for my undergrad. And I was recruited by Accenture even before I finished graduation and ended up doing kind of business management strategy consulting for the government for about a decade. And I was primarily in the DC area, but it did take me to Australia, and I was at the Australian tax office. And while there, I was more interested in the building there than the work that I was there to do. And it was just such a transformative experience for me. I had always really felt the environments that I worked in, but it was only at that time that I really started thinking, perhaps this is something that I could do as a job with my life. I hadn't planned to go back to school, but in order to make a really intentional strategic career change, I felt like that would be necessary to go back and get a master's. So I did a sustainable design degree at an architecture school in London. It was very scientific in its approach, even though the school oftentimes is not thought to be that. This program was. And it was all about how you could retrofit and design buildings so they would require less energy. So a very sustainable environmental design approach, hence it being called SED, which is the program name. And so while I enjoyed that side of it and having that foray from engineering and business into architecture, what I found really enlightening was a visiting professor from Cambridge who was talking about adaptive comfort theory and emphasizing the occupants and that human element rather than just looking at the designers and the designers' roles and, what that should look like within built environment landscape. And so I quite liked that. And because I had been doing some digital transformation in the past with change management and IT, I got into smart, sustainable strategy work. So looking at smart buildings, how those might come into play when working with people and, the types of buildings they wanted to inhabit in the future. But also with respect to energy conservation measures, understanding how buildings were used, how you could do changes, whether they be small or whether they be large CapEx kind of projects, to be able to realize some cost savings, but then also, have a more sustainable approach. And so I did that for a little while before then getting into more of the smart building landscape. But it became a little too tech as a panacea for me. And I had been lucky enough to be in DC when the well building standard was just kind of being thought up. And I went to a brown bag at Gensler around 2014, 2015, maybe. And it was just like the idea of the V1. And I thought, this is really where things are going. I think health and well-being, looking at occupants and looking at the environment overall, the natural environment, that's really what I'm looking to do. Like that's what drew me to built environment was sustainability. And then as I learned more about it, the people element. And so I wanted to focus on that. And so I decided to start my own company. And when I was thinking through branding and naming, I was on holiday in London and came across the term eudaimonia, a term I knew nothing about. I had never taken philosophy a day in my life. And it's basically a concept that is in alignment with sometimes happiness, but really human flourishing. And Aristotle furthered the research the most on that. It was Plato's idea, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle ran with it, kind of made it his own. And it was primarily interpreted as human flourishing, or the way that I like to think of it is being your best self, which is another way that it's oftentimes conceptualized as. So I thought, wow, let's think about not just designing for health and well-being. What if we actually designed for thriving, flourishing, eudaemonic well-being? And I crazily decided to accept an offer to do a PhD in Australia and have that be the foundation upon which the Eudae Group consultancy was built on, and have been exploring that ever since. So I finished my PhD last year, and it's all about designing for your best self, how we can realize environments that support optimal physical, mental, social health and well-being, while potentially making us better humans, and then the designers who are doing some of that work, better designers as well.
Manage the connection between building occupants and the outside world using Solera translucent glass. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Oh, that's fantastic, Jenna. Well, first of all, let's say this is going to be really interesting. We have two piano-playing engineers having a conversation, so this will be lots of fun. You mentioned the term adaptive comfort theory. I don't have a single question on that, so I'm going off script right out of the gate. I'm going to throw you off right at the beginning. Can you just define adaptive comfort theory to me? Because that sounds so interesting.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I learned about it formally, but basically it's just recognizing the role that occupants play and allowing that interaction with the built environments. I think that's something that is obviously just necessary. It sounds like common sense, but as we know, when it comes to people in built environment, whether it's architects, engineers, whomever, it comes down to simplification. And sometimes simplification means removing that autonomy and control from the people who occupy the spaces. So by having adaptive comfort theory, you're allowing for that feedback mechanism and the interaction and the freedom for people to be able to go and just open and close a window, rather than have something that's smart buildings related that would just relegate everything to be automated and have, shading at certain times of day and then closed envelope at certain times of day. It's allowing for that nuance and the actual experiential side of building inhabitants. That's key.
Wonderful. I hope my friend Marcel Herman is listening to this episode. I think he'd really enjoy it. Do you know Marcel?
I do, yeah. Not well, but I know him and I really respect his work. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, I hope he's listening. This is going to be great. All right. So as you mentioned at the beginning, you have an interesting career. I think I could build a 5-hour interview just based on the resume that's on LinkedIn. So I want to go there first. You are an honorary fellow at the Center for Wellbeing Science at Melbourne University. Can you tell us about that, about the Center for Wellbeing Science? What's its mandate and how it goes about achieving its goals?
Yeah. So I actually did look up the mandate just so that I would know for this interview in particular. It says that well-being is at the heart of helping individuals and communities thrive, and describes itself as a leading research center in positive psychology and well-being science, employing evidence-based approaches to measure well-being and promote positive change across diverse environments, including education, workplaces, performing arts, and sports. So that's kind of the mandate, quote unquote. But my role is really just, I'm an honorary fellow there. So I was a guest speaker last year to share some of the output of my PhD, because I did my PhD in Brisbane and then relocated down to Melbourne around mid 2023. And so I was just trying to connect with different groups. And again, because I have these connections with engineering, business, architecture, et cetera, the groups that a lot of the work resonates with most tends to be business or education, folks that just understand that there's kind of this messy gray area with, working towards wicked problem solving. And so when I talked to them, they really appreciated not only the environmental approach to applying well-being science within space, but then also understanding that a lot of times you need that supportive organizational infrastructure as well. And, that's become more common understanding with workplace well-being and COVID, shining a light on some of that understanding. But, having somebody who just did a PhD and oftentimes PhD students tend to be quite focused and specialized. I wasn't coming out as somebody who was only architecture focused and only maybe gerontology focused because I worked with older adults. I chose to work with older adults in the home because I wanted an inclusive design approach. I wanted to co-design meaningfully with them as a demographic to impact other demographics. So a very strategic decision. And then even how I exit home, I don't normally work on residential, but everybody was at home during COVID. And when I kicked off my PhD, it was, all right, we're going to have to do home because there's very little else we could do. So they appreciated all those different things that I was, also influenced by and curious about. And it's just been a really ripe opportunity and environment for me to be able to further some of that work and do some guest lecturing, but then also, have possible collaborations too that build out of that.
Oh, fantastic. All right. You talked about your company, the Eudae Health Group. You are the founder and the managing partner. First of all, you spoke about eudaemonic design in your introduction, but let's go a little deeper. Can you help us understand, flourishing? I get that. And I think it's amazing. I think it's wonderful. It's a step beyond human-centric design for sure. But can you go into a little more detail about, what are the elements of eudaemonic design or some of the basic methodologies that allow you to achieve your goals?
So with eudaimonic design, it is really built on architectural science and building physics knowledge because that's where I come from. So, I work with different International Well Building Institute, like the well building, being able to understand some of the standard, and then GSA's fit well, being able to apply some of that knowledge, but taking it a step further so it's realized by the humans and optimized. And, being able to do that in such a way that is not just architecturally science based, but also well being science based. And when I was looking at how I could design for eudaimonia, the best way to do that was through well-being science, which is why I'm now within this group. And well-being science is a newer way of saying positive psychology. It's a newer term of positive psychology, if you're familiar with that. And positive psychology is not to be known as, toxic positivity or some of those other pieces. It's really just, having a different mindset. It all started with Martin Seligman, who's out of UPenn, and then it's kind of just taken shape from there. I quite like a theory that's called self-determination theory that builds a lot of this in the logic. And as I was looking at eudaimonia, there was some great research about if you design for self-determination theory, that's considered to be a means of designing for eudaimonia. And self-determination theory, or SDT, is comprised by three tenets. So it's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so if you design for those, the thought is that you would hopefully be able to have this living well or eudaimonic lifestyle. And so I wanted to test that out because I didn't really see that being done. And ironically, I met with Richard Ryan this morning, who is one of the co-founders of self-determination theory. And this is not something that's being done, considering SDT too much in built environment. And so by having that juxtaposed well-being science with architectural science approach, you have a basis of inside out and outside in support. So SDT also encourages intrinsic motivation. And that's when people want to do more, they want to learn, they want to do better. And so I thought that would also be able to get into this idea of nudging people into better behavior without making it be, like this puppeteer sort of mandate, as sometimes was considered to be the case when I was doing my master's, and we were being taught, nudging behaviors, using technology to nudge. This was really different. This was about, how we can actually create spaces so that people would want to do different things or perhaps have intentional engagement. And so with Eudae Group, a lot of the work that I do is quite open in nature. Sometimes it's just somebody comes to me saying, we're having some issues, just figuring out where we want to go. We want to get the portfolio to be a little bit more health and well-being balanced. We don't really see some good examples of that. Is that something that you can come share where globally this is being done well? How we can maybe integrate that into our day-to-day or in some of these key projects at the moment. Sometimes it's getting people on board and just having the conversations to have the engineers and the architects and all of the other people at the table to be able to have some of the more difficult conversations at the same time. Sometimes it's even just raising awareness as to who the people at the table should be, because oftentimes occupants are forgotten, facility managers are forgotten. So all those different voices and having a very inclusive design approach to the process. And while eudaimonic design, and just again, that's my term for designing for eudaimonia, it did have this output of 9 principles, each on a continuum. And a lot of those balance out different things that might change over the course of people's lives, emphasizing Aristotle's notion of having peaks and valleys of a eudaimonic authentic life. It's not about perfection. It's about, a realistic take. And while that did come out with principles and a model, what came as most revelatory was this unintended consequence of people wanting to do different things that they had even put off for ages. So a couple of actually more than a couple, the participants, the older adults, as well as the design professional participants that I had, were sharing stories with me early on about how they were wanting to do different things to make their spaces better. And it would be prompted by different things. It was just us talking about self-determination theory and eudaimonia while on a Zoom. And then they would see my plant in the background. And they would say, you know what, I could really use some more biophilia in my home now that I've learned that term. I know that there's this innate connection between humans and nature. I'm going to go ahead and talk to my kids about getting a plant. And so that would open up a conversation for relatedness for them at home. They would be able to have this connection with their family members. And then every time they would see the plant, they would remind them of their kids who had got them the plant. And so sometimes it was just really organic like that. Sometimes it was along the lines of things that had been procrastinated for ages. I had some participants who just didn't want to finish their taxes, and they had a room that they were just keeping tax documents, and they would keep the door closed. And they were sharing with me, by working on these workshops and thinking about eudaimonia and being my best self and having a best self-supported space made me want to finally take care of some of those things. So it was just really fun to see that this wasn't just about creating something that would be used for the design community. It was about something that would actually empower everybody who encompasses space. And that could be really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay, boy, we could talk about that for hours and hours. All right. I think this is a natural lead into my next question, which is, back to your LinkedIn profile again. First words on your profile are flourishing by design. All right. So is that something different? Can you explain what that means?
It's not something different. That's really just a semantic terminology transition because, eudaimonia, not everybody knows it. It is becoming a little bit more well known, but because eudaimonia and human flourishing are fairly synonymous, or at least the interpretation that I like to take that is what I'm more subscribing to now. So when I say flourishing, we have flourishing environments by design, which sometimes I also put into the LinkedIn. It just depends. But I have also created this group of practitioners this past year, and our collective is called Flourishing by Design. And that's all through Harvard's Human Flourishing Network. So we're one of their official special interest groups. And when I met with some of the flourishing scholars last year, I was asking them, is this being put into practice in many places? Is that something that you're seeing much of? And they said, to some degree, and especially when it comes to, again, organizational flourishing, yes. But when it comes to actual tactile exploration of a subject matter or spaces, that's not being done as much. And I had some fantastic contacts from a variety of groups that I'm involved with. And I really wanted to just be able to bring them together because not everybody has the opportunity to do passion projects and explore some of these topics in their day-to-day lives when they're paying the bills. And I mean, I could think of just 50 people off the top of my head globally that I wanted to try to connect with. And so that's what happened around January. I kind of put out an expression of interest. And then we kicked off our first meeting in August. And we have about 180 people now. But so Flourishing by Design is about, that group. It's about my process, how I like to design spaces. It's the intentionality of the praxis. It's a little bit of everything.
All right. Before I move on, I have to do a quick sidebar for our listeners. Eudae is spelled Eudae. So for anyone who wanted to look that up, Eudae is the way it's spelled, and Eudaemonic is Eudaemonic. So I had to do that. I'm going off script again, just a little tiny bit, Jenna, so forgive me. But can you tell me the main difference between human-centric design and eudaemonic design?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there is that much of a difference. I think that, it's about that intention. It's making sure that the process, it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. So as long as that's accounted for, I can't say all human-centric design allows for that process emphasis. So perhaps there's a little bit of differentiation there. And then also with human-centric, sometimes it's really just satisfying, at the bare minimum, rather than thinking about where things could go and having a more flourishing approach and optimal satisfaction of physical, mental, social health. Yeah, just all those different pieces. So hopefully it's elevating that perspective a bit and, having it not be too centric. But also, I would hesitate even saying human centric because good flourishing design shouldn't just focus on the Anthropocene and having it be focused on humans only. It should be a more than human approach. So, if you're doing it right, and again, having intrinsic motivation, which would hopefully prompt pro social proclivities, having people want to do better, make better decisions, hopefully that would also contribute to better natural environments. So it would be a little bit even more than human centric rather than just human centric.
Brilliant. I love that. All right, I have to move on because there's so many things I want to cover. You wrote a piece recently about the idea of having and I'll use the term you used exactly, a pragmatic futurist
Yes.
or a futurist in residence involved with your design team. Can you explain that idea for us?
Yes, it's really interesting. It was something from IDEO they posted, and I just wanted to be able to share that within my network. There's so many ways that I could address this, and I'll try not to go into too much of a rabbit hole. But, I think it's about considering something thoughtfully from an optimistic, but also protective mitigation strategy perspective, layering in things like flourishing scholarship and exploratory methods to ideate before realizing. So I really enjoy a lot of design futuring. I had always done it with the workshopping that I would do. But again, being an engineer, I have a very pragmatic approach to the design futuring world. So when we were just futuring for the sake of futuring, that wasn't really my favorite thing to do. I like to be able to see where people wanted to go, but in very real terms of, all right, 1 year versus 2 years versus 5 years. Let's really try to specifically work through milestones. And, sometimes there's this notion of the art of the possible, where it's a little bit more ridiculous design approach to tech as a panacea. And, we're all thinking about cyborgs, aliens, dystopian versus utopian viewpoints. But to me, it needs to be balanced. It needs to be steeped in reality. And while I think being provocative and out there certainly has its place, I think it's really important to connect the past, the present, and the future. And I really try to intentionally do that within my creative methods. So, interrogating and reflecting on the past, being able to learn from that, have that be informed by the context of today, and then understanding where you want to go in the future for those visceral connections across self, other, space, and time. And to me, a pragmatic futurist, if we're going to use that term, really reflects on and learns from those things and, builds on deep scientific knowledge as well as broad acumen. And that's where that depth and breadth comes together with respect to a really good pragmatic futurist. Will be able to have a good understanding of things, but be able to connect the dots and distill that knowledge for a variety of people that they're collaborating with.
And where does one find a pragmatic futurist?
Ah, we're few and far between.
Are there any universities turning out professional pragmatic futurists, or is this just that you get to know them from within the industry, the people who have that skill set
It's a really
and
good
that
question.
innate
I
ability?
have been hearing more about strategic design programs. I've been involved with a few just being able to feed into curriculum. Some of them have been built off of engineering schools, but most are coming from design schools. So I like that's happening. And that is a bit of a side passion project of mine is making sure to uplift the necessity for transdisciplinary people. I'm still a bit surprised this day and age, 20 plus years into a career that there is still this siloed tendency for so many things. And, again, we always hear that wicked problems are only going to be solved and tackled by people who can understand and embrace the discomfort and understand, all these different perspectives. Yet we don't really have a lot of roles that exist to be able to support that. And we don't have a lot of pathways or curriculum and, study focuses that allow for that either. So it's getting better, but it is like chinking away slowly.
Okay. I have to ask you a question, and it's related to my own world. How much do you dive into sort of the conventional, i.e., IEQ world, like daylighting and fresh air and acoustic comfort, thermal comfort? How much does that come into, the sort of work you do in eudaemonic design? And
Yeah, it certainly does play a role. It used to be very much in the kind of forefront of my approach. It was all architectural science, especially kind of in the early 2010s. And, as I became a WELL AP and an advisor for them, I think that understanding certainly forms a sound foundation of my baseline. And then really from there, I just try to get a little bit more into the specifics and understanding about, while there are rules and, kind of guidelines about how to do some of these things, then there are these other factors that should be considered, such as, different types of people experiencing spaces differently, and being able to emphasize that need for co-design and, kind of an integrated approach to be able to collaborate and understand where science might tell us this, but we know that's normally science of the averages. How can we really be able to interpret that in a way that's going to make the most sense for this group that I'm working with? And, sometimes and oftentimes I'm working with fantastic architecture engineering teams, but, every so often, humans are fallible. So sometimes just having a few different reminders for each other and, being able to have that skill set and that knowledge base to be able to reflect on and pull from can be helpful, and just being able to say, okay, well, one thing I noticed is that in the current design, this is lacking. Maybe this is something that we could beef up a little bit more, or, this seems to have been forgotten. Is there a reason for that? Those sorts of things. So they play a part, but it's certainly not the only part now.
do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful, natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Right. Yeah. Okay. I understand. All right. So this next question, you and I had a little bit of an email exchange about. I found a term in one of your articles that fascinated me, and we had a little bit of an exchange about whether I got the context right, and even asking the question. So I'm going to ask it. Let's just do it, and I'm dying to hear how you answer. What is a ubiquitous home? What does it mean, and how does it help?
I think we're making it a little bit more exciting than I intended the post to
Oh, well,
be.
let's make it
I
exciting. Come on.
know. I didn't mean to be a letdown. I didn't mean to build it up if I did. But really, the idea of, and it was actually termed, I had it open. And then, of course, when I had to reboot before talking to you, I now have to reopen it. But the quote was ubiquitous home, office space, hospital, or school. So I said, although I tend to explore the subject of flourishing design in the context of the ubiquitous home, office space, hospital, or school, sometimes I get to work on passion projects like cancer centers, etc. And so in
Okay.
this regard,
Okay.
I was thinking of ubiquitous home, office space, hospital, or school, all as kind of different examples of kind of the everyday project, the common
Gotcha.
projects.
Gotcha.
So it's not even just home in particular. It was, those four typologies, if you will. And, being able to have a bit of an intentional shift towards some more specialized projects, which I found really enlightening.
Okay, well, I'm not terribly disappointed. I'm glad to have that cleared up.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, no worries. Oh, my goodness, no. All right, so let's talk about something a little more serious. You have designed spaces for cancer centers. Tell me what sort of elements you built into those spaces that would be useful, helpful for cancer patients.
Yeah, so with this, I think that it's so interesting to be able to apply it from different perspectives, lived experience, caretaker experience, etc. And I have had a variety of different experiences, having done surgeries myself and been a caretaker, a family member. So this is always something that I've been wanting to contribute to. And recently, it's been really lovely to be able to weigh in on spaces that would allow for caretakers because, when you're going with people, there is not space for you to just go and either have a moment, have a conversation, maybe have a meal, without having to go and, eat really unhealthily, those sorts of things. But then also just having a space that's going to allow for the sensory experience. So, you don't have this cacophony that you're surrounded by within a hospital. It's being able to just go and have a respite. And whether it's soundscape, smell, oftentimes just the different types of things that people want to feel with neuropathy or not feel, just balancing out a lot of those different pieces. And I've really enjoyed being able to work with people on the actual patient rooms, but then like the family rooms that we were talking about, well-being centers, which are becoming more common also. And then I've been writing a few pieces about those. So I'm starting to explore some of those and compare it to examples like Maggie's centers, which are, known for having some great opportunities for visual stimulation and interest, spatial design, having different references to biophilic principles through, a variety of fractals. But, and having natural atmospheres and wood and things like that to be able to touch and have that engagement with. And that grounding feeling is sometimes what's really needed by a cancer patient who feels as if the ground is being just pulled out from under them. So all those different pieces really build up into supporting the self-determination theory aspects, again, of autonomy, competence, relatedness, is giving them that control back in their lives in a way that is very fundamental and very fully realized by being a space that surrounds them and potentially hugs them if they feel really comfortable in the space. So, and a lot of times too, people who are experiencing some kind of cancer or, going through treatment, they're also feeling things like migraines. So making sure that we're allowing for light sensitivity, depression, sometimes you want more light to be able to offset depression. So making sure that you have spaces allocated for that. But then even most importantly, and what's oftentimes forgotten is communicating those spaces as being available to people. Because a lot of times people go to the trouble of creating them and then they just sit there unutilized. And, then it's considered to be, if post occupancy evaluated, unsuccessful and then not repeated. And that's unfortunate. So it's really just tying all those different loose ends together and making sure that it's a comprehensive experience that people can enjoy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've found myself in the past almost being guilty about utilizing those sorts of spaces, soothing spaces, rest,
Yeah.
recovery type spaces. It's weird, but I get this feeling of I shouldn't be here. I should be out in the plain, boring hall in an uncomfortable chair rather than in here because that's not for me, even though I, just spent the night in the ER with my daughter or whatever. Can you comment on that? Do people commonly experience guilt in taking advantage of, really well designed, comfortable biophilic spaces?
Yes, you're not alone in that. And I think some of it is somewhat cultural too. Certainly in certain environments and certain cultures and countries, that's felt more so.
Canadian.
Um, but I think it's becoming less so. It's becoming more normal to be talking about things like a well-being room or, just being able to have a sensory comfortable space, whatever that feels like, whether it's, hyper or hypo, and allowing for some of those preferences. And then, just being able to have the awareness that these things exist and the rationale behind doing them, I think automatically affords people the opportunity to take advantage of them. They understand that it's important, they recognize that, and then they feel a little less awkward and then therefore judged at using them. And hopefully can also feel the impact of those spaces on them and giving them just a moment to collect themselves and figure out what needs to be done next before just, diving right on in prematurely. That's so important.
Oh, I love that. Now, you've also designed spaces, education spaces specifically for neurodivergent students. What elements or processes are different or specific to designing for neurodivergent students?
Yeah, I think with this is also quite interesting just because it's so difficult to do it in a way that, isn't distilling it to something that's prescriptive. And so this is really where it becomes key to engage as much as possible and, be able to understand what people really want. So in this regard, sometimes it's being able to have that prospect and refuge theory, giving people the opportunity. So, like, if a child wants to be able to sit and, be protected in a space, but watch what's happening, a lot of times that's fantastic and really just allows them to feel like a space is theirs, but, not having the stress and the anxiety that might come with being in the middle of everybody and having to engage. It's also things like having color. So, perhaps some color that is going to be interesting to them, but not off putting or stress inducing. So, figuring some of that out too. And of course, there's a lot of great color theory that can be referenced for this. But again, it comes down to working with the groups to see what people prefer. And then one thing that's often forgotten is just the social connection element. And there's been some fantastic work, especially the past year or two, around social connection, designing for that. And then the different continuum also of, having privacy versus connection. So making sure that connection can be allowed for and designed for in ways that gives people choice. And, this is a great example of autonomy, being able to live in spaces, occupy spaces on your terms. And knowing that tomorrow you might have a different preference. So just, offering those different options to everybody, including children. And a lot of times that's forgotten that children have those varying needs. Like, everybody recognizes that kids change over time, but they don't expect there to be this volatility from day to day. But really, they're humans, they're little humans. We all have these different needs every single day, different reaction points. We're all, emotive. And, just offering some of that continuum side of things. Again, it's, not necessarily having this perfect answer all the time, but doing those options for people. And
Lo-
that seems to be the best way of working with the different groups.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. We have to talk about music a little bit. As we mentioned at the beginning, we're both musicians. Tell me about the important aspects of designing for a performance space.
So, of course, you have to make sure that you don't have the echoes, that you have a good balance of the hard and soft materiality to absorb just enough, but then also be able to, resonate. But, it's also making sure that you can have the views while allowing for the sound, which is sometimes a compromise. That can be difficult, and also just have a warm atmosphere. And that's why you see a lot of really beautiful recital halls that have only wood, and maybe just vertical cuts of wood or something somewhat decorative just to make it somewhat more interesting. But oftentimes it is just that natural fiber of the wood that really works beautifully in conducting and buffering the sound in a way that just balances. And that's really where you can get that tuned environment and the harmony that comes with it, all puns intended. But that's really what's intriguing. And I think the other piece that aligns really nicely with well-being science and positive psychology is that notion of flow. I'm sure that you've probably heard of that. Other people have heard of it. It's kind of like being in the zone. It became famous with Csikszentmihalyi, and he kind of started this ages ago with the notion of flow. And just this past year, I've posted a little bit about it on LinkedIn, but there have been attempts at reverse engineering. So you could design for flow. And some of the most thought-provoking work has been with respect to jazz musicians. And so when they're like deep in the zone of just jamming or, just playing something out, then that's really where they can experience flow. So sometimes it's not only thinking about the audience experience, it's thinking about the performer. And I was actually surprised how little thought goes into the performer's experience on a stage when it comes to recital hall design. And, thinking about it when I was doing more performance ages ago, it was really just, get me up there, get it done, and then move on. But the people who are up there for, 30 minutes to hours long performing, they just think it's an occupational hazard to be blinded by lights and overheated by the atmosphere. And it doesn't have to be that way. And, fog machines. I was just in a show a couple of months ago and we had this fog machine that was killing us the entire time. I had no voice the rest of the weekend because it was just doing something to my body that was not normal. So it's, understanding all the different players and making sure that you can have resonating design. Again, I'm using all these nice little pun terms, but It's very true. And, music is something that people are quite particular about for those who appreciate music. So you want to make sure that there is that perfect balance struck. And I'm still kind of interrogating the subject myself. I'm not an acoustic expert, I would say, but I certainly am very highly sensory sensitive. So I'm very particular about sound, making sure that there's not something that's too annoying that might prompt some misophonia and therefore, anger or something that just doesn't sound quite right. But also, allows for just a lovely experience. And I think that experience is what we're all after.
That is the first time I've ever heard anybody talking about designing for the performers. That was just magic to my ears to hear that. It was music, literally music to my ears. So that was wonderful. It's funny. I saw a cartoon, an animated movie recently called Soul. Have you seen it?
I've seen part of it. Yeah, on the
John
plane. I haven't seen the
Baptiste
whole thing.
plays for the musician, and much of the movie, one of the main components of the movie is this discussion about being in the flow, and
Yeah.
it even makes the connection between a supposed afterlife and our experience on Earth, and when we're in the flow, it's the same experience. Anyway, it's wonderful
Yeah.
to hear you talk about that and any sort of design aspect that would bring us closer to those moments, and we've all had them, is highly desirable, and I commend you for that. Okay, we've reached the point in the show, Jenna, where I ask my $1,000,000 question. I ask every single guest this question, and I ask them to answer it from whatever perspective they'd like in this particular moment. What makes a great building?
It's such a loaded question. But for me, I have to say it comes down to buildings that enable us to realize our best selves, supporting us through those troughs of challenging times and highlighting the peaks of the best times, uplifting us then, helping us realize flourishing of humans and more than humans through sustainable design and operations, and developing an appreciation for the art, science, possibility, and ineffability of space. One thing that you don't hear much about is, well, you talk about maybe space time continuum in a lot of circles, but you often don't hear about space people time continuum. And I think that recognizing that deep interplay at heart with respect to humans and the buildings that they inhabit, that is really key. And that's what I like to look at when I'm thinking about how can I make a building better? Where can we have that inherent connection, whether it be through environmental psychology or, neuroarchitecture to ameliorate stress based on ceiling heights or, improve cognitive function with better air quality, or maybe enhance connection through spatial orientation and elements of biophilic design. The possibilities are really endless. So we just need people with the smarts and the know-how to pull from different fields of work to make something magical and beautiful and put that creative genius to work.
Amazing, amazing. Jenna, before we go, do you have any exciting news or any announcements or anything that you'd like to promote?
So let's see, a couple of things with Flourishing by Design for our group. Like I said, we just got underway a few months ago. So we're starting out 2025 with reflecting on the past and looking to see where we want to go in the future as a collective. So I think that will be really exciting. And, we're really trying to have interesting speakers to have different viewpoints of flourishing because, as we touched upon, there are a lot of different ways that it can be interpreted. So we want to have both that arts as well as science approach, quant versus qual, et cetera. And then in addition to that, it's just, ongoing work, being able to understand and appreciate how people can experience flourishing in different environments, whether they be, spatial, organizational, whatever, but especially spatial in my case, and being able to support some of the groups that need the most support instead of just designing for the averages. That's really where I appreciate inclusive environments approaches. And, been learning more about design for all the past few years and become more specialized in true co-design instead of just using it as a buzzword. So I'm excited to do more of that going forward. And then I do have one kind of serial entrepreneur kind of project happening too, in addition to some of the actual research I'm doing. But I'm starting a little bit of a side project on working through uplifting transdisciplinary work. And we haven't announced it just yet, but it's going to essentially be contributing to some of that ideology and being able to help people realize their inner creative geniuses.
Jenna, you are an absolutely amazing person. I could listen to you talk all day, but it's getting very late here in Eastern Canada,
Oh,
and I really need to get home. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It was an absolute joy. I'm so happy that we were able to make this happen.
Yeah, me too. You take care. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.